Today's lecture is on cryptoeconomics and proof of stake. And the reason it's called cryptoeconomics and proof of stake is with proof of work, you're buying hardware and you don't really get to see how someone gets rewards or how someone gets penalized for acting in a malicious manner. At least it's a very non-obvious situation. But with proof of stake, it's a lot more simplified, and we'll see how that works today. So today we'll get started by talking about cryptoeconomics, what it means, and then build up with some cryptographic primitives, and then some economic concepts which we're going to put together and look at proof of stake from the perspective of a cryptoeconomic system. And finally, we'll look at some attacks and understand how cryptoeconomics has a role to play in defending against these attacks. So cryptoeconomics, what does it mean? Well, cryptoeconomics is basically a way to use cryptography to prove properties about events that happened in the past. So, for example, if you want to guarantee that the blockchain is immutable, you're using something like a hash, and that basically gives you this confidence that the blockchain cannot be tampered with or reordered. And that's a cryptographic property which you're relying on. Economic incentives are used to encourage properties which you want that will hold in the future. So, for example, in Bitcoin, you want to ensure that miners are always going to be doing the job of putting together transactions, and the network is always going to have people who are transacting with each other. And for that, you give miners block rewards, or 12.5 BTC if you recall, as an incentive to do the job that they're doing. So let's talk a little bit about the cryptographic primitives that we'll be using. So if you guys remember from Nadir and Gloria's lecture, hashes are basically functions which take in an input of a fixed size. Take in an input and give you an output of a fixed size. So it's kind of like a fingerprint machine, which gives you like a unique output, or an output that appears to be unique. And we use hashes to prove the immutability of blockchain. So the reason you use hash pointers is so that now anyone in the future cannot tamper with the previous block, and as long as the past blocks are valid, you have to reorder the whole history, or like rewrite the whole history. That's the only way you can change the blockchain. So hashes basically gives us this guarantee against reordering or restarting of the blockchain in any way. Signatures, again, like ECDSA, which Gloria or Nadir talked about in the previous lecture, help you verify that only a certain specific person sent you that message. So that means I can't pretend to be Gloria and send Nadir 5 Bitcoin from my address. The rest of the network wouldn't believe that if I didn't have Gloria's signature on it. Erasure codes. So we'll look at this later on in the attack section, but they basically lower the boundary of the data that needs to be available on the blockchain. So the idea is basically that if you have some amount of data, when you transmit it, it's going to lose a few packets. So to prevent against that, you encode the data in a certain way. So for example, if I'm sending Aparna across this malicious network, then the idea is that maybe I could send Aparna, so concatenate Aparna twice, and hopefully you'll receive at least one of that, which will help you get the original data back. And we'll look at this more closely in the data unavailability problem. And then we have another primitive called time locks. So time locks are basically this guarantee that some amount of time has passed between sending message A and message B. So time locks are basically just a kind of encryption on a piece of data that takes a fixed amount of time to decrypt it, and this decryption process cannot be sped up through any kind of parallelization. So for example, if I sent 5 Bitcoin to Gloria, instead of sending the miner my transaction, I send the miner an encryption of my transaction called C and a product of two large primes P and Q. This is going to take the miner log n time, no matter what he does, to retrieve my original transaction. And this plays a very important role in defending against censorship attacks, as we'll see. So far we've talked about some of the essential cryptographic primitives. Let's now build up our mental model of all the little economic penalties, rewards that we're going to be using. So there are two important concepts with economic incentives, that of rewards and penalties. But to reward or penalize someone, you need to give or take something away. And what is that something? It's basically tokens or privileges. Tokens are basically units of a protocol-defined cryptocurrency that you give out to miners. So for example, block rewards are tokens of Bitcoin or even Ethereum. Privileges are basically decision-making rights that you're giving to the miners so that they can use that and extract rent. So an example of this is transaction fees in the Bitcoin blockchain. Rewards is basically a mechanism to give honest actors of a network these tokens and privileges, and penalties are just a way to take away these tokens and privileges from malicious or evil people in the network. So to understand how rewards and penalties fit in, we need to look at a couple of other concepts, like cryptoeconomic security margin. So that is basically an amount of money such that you can give or prove that either given a guarantee G is satisfied, or those at fault for violating that guarantee will be poorer by this cryptoeconomic security margin. So for example, I could give you a guarantee that the next James Bond movie is going to raise, say, $150 billion. And if that guarantee is violated, the producers, the director, the actors, all of them will be poorer by at least maybe $100 if that's my cryptoeconomic security margin. And then you have this concept of cryptoeconomic proof. That is basically a message which is signed by an actor that can be interpreted as, I certify that this proof is true. If not, I'm willing to put myself out there and suffer a loss of the cryptoeconomic security margin. So if I am giving you the guarantee that the James Bond movie is going to raise that much money, I'm putting myself out there at risk of losing $100, which is your cryptoeconomic security margin. Now, so far we've talked about a lot of these different concepts, but we need to understand what incentivizes or motivates all the actors in our network. So that's why we look at choice models. So we have two main kinds of choice models. The first is an uncoordinated choice model. In this, you assume that all the participants are independent and don't want to coordinate with each other. They all have different incentives, different driving or motivating factors. So an example of this, if you're familiar with game theory, is the hawk-dove game. So the idea is hawk basically represents fight, and dove basically means retreat or go into a peace mode. So for example, if Gloria and Nadir decided to fight with each other, they would both maybe gain a reward of $10 each. But if Nadir decided to fight and Gloria decided to retreat, Nadir will get $20 and Gloria gets $0. The idea here is neither party really wants to coordinate with each other, and the best way that they can raise as much money for themselves is to fight with each other. And then you have the coordinated choice model. An example of this is if you and your boyfriend are going on date night, you want to go wherever you go together. So either you both go boxing together or you both go shopping together, but whatever you do, you want to coordinate with your boyfriend. And in this, you're assuming that all the actors have some common incentive or some common motivating factor. And then you have the bribing attacker model, which takes this uncoordinated model where all the different actors have different incentives anyway. And the attacker now tries to bribe some actors to act in a certain way that the attacker wants. So an example of this is called shelling coin. So if you guys remember back to the Ethereum lecture where we had oracles which feed in external data into the blockchain, maybe you have a question like, did Trump win the 2017 election? And all the oracles either vote yes or no. If the majority vote yes, yes is deemed to be the correct answer, and now everyone who voted according to majority gets a reward, and everyone else who voted according to minority gets penalized. But what if I was a malicious actor? Well, something to note here is if everyone is economically rational, then everyone is trying to make as much money as possible, so they're going to try and vote whatever they think the majority is going to vote. So in the uncoordinated game, without an attacker, you would vote 0 if you think, or you would vote yes if you think everyone is going to vote yes. You would vote no if you think everyone else is going to vote no. But now if you have an attacker who wants to get everyone to vote the wrong answer, so if I was the attacker, I could just bribe you with 5 extra cents over the reward that you get and tell you, if you vote no, Trump did not win this election, I will pay you 5 extra cents as long as you're in the minority. If you're in the majority, then you get no money from me, you get the reward anyway. And this simple change basically gets everyone else, or incentivizes every player in the network to vote that Trump didn't actually win, when we know that's clearly not the case. And that is the bribing attacker game. So we've looked at all these different choice models, understood all these different actors in our system, but how do they all come together? Like, what do they do? To understand that, let's take a look at a cryptoeconomic system called proof of stake. So what is proof of stake? Well, proof of stake is an alternative consensus algorithm where your voting power is directly proportional to the economic stake that you lock up into the network. So for example, if Gloria locks up 10 Ether and Nadir locks up 20 Ether, Nadir's voting power is twice as much as Gloria's voting power. Examples of proof of stake algorithms are Casper, which is an Ethereum proof of stake, going to be implemented by 2018. Then you have Tendermint, NXT, Purecoin, and Blackcoin. What is an alternative consensus algorithm? Well, basically, you have all these transactions happening on the Bitcoin network, right? How does everyone know what is valid? In Bitcoin, you use proof of work to tell you what transactions are valid. Proof of stake is basically just a replacement for proof of work. So let's compare proof of work and proof of stake to improve our understanding a little better. In proof of work, you have this process called mining to create valid blocks and authorize certain transactions as valid and okay. In proof of stake, the same process is called minting, and the more tokens that you lock up, the more voting power you have. In proof of work, we rely on these stakeholders called miners who have computational power. Versus in proof of stake, since no one has any kind of computational resources, you're relying on validators who have locked up money into the system. Basically, miners in proof of work are the same as validators in proof of stake without any of the machinery. So there are 2 kinds of proof of stake systems. One is the Byzantine fault tolerance proof of stake, and another is a chain-based proof of stake. Without worrying too much about the terminology, we'll understand how each of these works and what makes them different. So here's a very simplified version of a chain-based proof of stake, which I call Aparna's chain-based proof of stake. And the process is pretty much these 3 steps. The first is you choose a validator from your existing group of validators. And this is weighted on all the stake that all the people in the network have invested. The second is this chosen validator now creates a block. So he basically does all the work that a miner in proof of work does, which means looks into the pending transaction pool, looks at what transactions are valid, what he wants to include, puts them together in a block, makes a Merkle tree, and then creates that block. And this block basically points to any other previously created block. It could either be the last block in the blockchain, or it could be any of the previous ones if the validator believes the last block was invalid or doesn't contain any, or contains like malicious transactions. And then finally, this chosen validator for doing all this good work for us gets paid in block rewards and transaction fees. Questions so far? Okay. So one way I like to distinguish between the chain-based and the BFT-based proof of stake is in the chain-based proof of stake, the validator creates a block, versus in the BFT proof of stake, the validator proposes a block. So this is an example of Aparna BFT-based proof of stake. Here, again, you repeat step one where the validator is randomly chosen based on your existing set. So, for example, if Gloria has 3 ether locked up, Nadir has 2, and I have 5, I should be picked as a validator 5 out of 10 times. Gloria should be picked 3 out of 10 times, and Nadir 2 out of 10 times. Now that we've chosen a validator, this validator proposes a block. What that means is, again, he does all the operations of creating a block, but it doesn't get added to the blockchain. Instead, he broadcasts it to everyone in the network and asks them all to vote. If majority think the block is valid, they vote yes. If they think it's invalid, they vote no. And if 2/3 or more of the voting participants vote yes, then the block is deemed valid and it's included in the blockchain. Otherwise, we pick a new proposer and repeat from step one. Now, if the block does get added to the blockchain, the proposer gets the reward and some transaction fees for doing the good work that he's doing. Questions? Okay. Yeah.
Is this based on the idea that anybody who owns the majority of the stake, who puts in a big stake, means that they own a lot and they want the best interest for that?
Exactly. Yeah. That's the whole idea.
What happens if I don't know what's best for the blockchain? Until I hold a majority, I think I know what's best, but in reality, it's not the best.
Well, if it's not the best, I'll talk about it more when we look at the drawbacks of proof of stake. But essentially, you end up burning all your money if you act in a way that's not best for the blockchain, and there's no way to recover from that. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
What is the incentive for people to vote if they're not mining?
Because whoever, so if they don't vote, the blockchain essentially doesn't add any new blocks, which means like it's going to remain in the same state. Like if everyone votes no, or if no one ever votes, then they really have, the blockchain's kind of stuck. So it's kind of based on this belief that, okay, if I vote on your block, you're also going to be responsive and vote on my block. And if you don't vote for long periods of time, you're considered offline or you're considered malicious. And then your funds or your deposit gets slashed. So yeah, good questions. So let's now talk a little bit about proof of work versus proof of stake and look at some of the advantages that proof of stake brings to the table. So how many of you have heard of the country Azerbaijan? So proof of work, or mining Bitcoin, takes the same amount of electricity as this country consumes, which is basically 0.1% of all the electricity consumption of the world. And that is a lot of wasted resources. So with proof of work, you're basically using up electricity running your ASICs. In proof of stake, you basically remove this energy consumption cycle and just pour back the money into your whole mining procedure. So of course, proof of stake is a lot more environmental friendly, has a better environmental footprint, etc. With proof of work, 51% attacks are not disincentivized. So what that means is, for example, if I started double spending because I have 51% of Bitcoin, or if I had 51% computational power, the price of Bitcoin would start to tank because people lose confidence in the network. But even if the price of Bitcoin tanks, I still have my ASICs. And it's like, okay, buy Bitcoin, hi Litecoin. I'm going to start mining on Litecoin. And I've really not lost that much. Versus in proof of stake, if you try to do a 51% attack and the network loses confidence, it's like burning down your ASIC farm. Because if the price of Ether starts tanking, then you have no way to sell this Ether. You're kind of stuck with it because no one wants to buy it and there's nothing else you can do with it. So you basically just burnt yourself. With proof of work, your rewards increase exponentially as you invest more money into buying hardware. So if you mine with a CPU versus if you mine with an ASIC, your rewards are definitely very different. But in proof of stake, your rewards are directly proportional to the stake that you invest. So if Gloria invests 10 Ether and Nadir invests 20 Ether and lock them up, then Nadir's likely gains are twice as much as what Gloria's likely gains are. Also, in proof of work, you might have this problem of unfair hardware distribution, cough, cough, China, where maybe China is selling discounted hardwares to certain mining pools, which means they can do all the computation much faster, and that could lead to centralization. But in proof of stake, because there's no real difference in what hardware you use, like your CPU is just as effective as an ASIC, you don't have this issue of unfair hardware distribution leading to centralization. But it doesn't mean proof of stake is a bed of roses because it has a lot of drawbacks. The first one is the rich get richer. So now, if I had 30% of the voting power and Gloria had 10%, I'm 3 times as likely to be chosen as a validator, which means I'm 3 times as likely to gain rewards. And that means I already own 30% of this voting power, but I'm just getting more and more power just because I'm getting money faster than Gloria is. In some of the earlier proof of stake models, they had this idea of giving the easiest mining puzzles to the richest of participants. And this was with the idea that, oh, if people are given the easiest mining puzzles, maybe they will put in more money and invest more. And this leads to another issue of dislodging 51% power is impossible, because if I had 51% power and I kept getting richer, my stake in the system is constantly increasing. So how are you going to overthrow me? Unless you maybe hard fork. Another issue is your funds are locked up, so you can't really liquidate them very quickly. Another downside of proof of stake is low participation can cause centralization. So what that means is, in Bitcoin, with a proof of work setting, if the original 2012 miners are no longer mining, new people can join in, just buy an ASIC and jump onto the network. But with proof of stake, stake is not really for sale. Like, either you've invested at the start or one of the stakeholders has to sell you their stake. But if these stakeholders become inactive, then the network falls into the hands of the few people who remain active. And that in itself leads to a lot of other problems. Another drawback is you can rewrite the history of the blockchain if someone with a share of stake just sells their private keys, but you can't do that in Bitcoin. Okay, so we look at the proof of stake crypto system model, and we talked about the different cryptographic primitives and the economic concepts. Now let's put them together and understand how different attacks in proof of stake work and how we can build up our defenses with cryptoeconomics against these attacks. So, any questions so far? Okay. So, one of the oldest known attacks in a chain-based proof of stake, chain-based, remember, is the one where you create the blocks, is that you only have rewards for creating blocks on multiple competing chains, but you don't have any penalties. So in any cryptoeconomic system, you have three kinds of actors. One is the economically rational. The second is the altruistic, honest actors. And the third are the malicious adversaries. So if all the actors are only economically rational, the blockchain never ever converges. So for example, if there was a fork and on chain A, Gloria sends Nadir 5 Bitcoin, and on chain B, Gloria sends me the same 5 Bitcoin, if the chains never ever converge, neither I nor Nadir know if we can spend our Bitcoin. And this is a huge downside, because if you remember, in Bitcoin, you have the adversaries battling the economically rational and the honest majority. But in this system, you have the adversaries and the economically rational fighting the altruists. And the altruists are likely to be only a few participants of the network. You also have this huge issue of trade-off between centralization and convergence. So what that means is, if I was a stakeholder and I had, say, 30% of voting power, 29% is on chain A and 1% is on chain B, then I'm likely to only sign on chain A just so I don't lose the voting power on chain A. But instead, if you have a lot of different participants or validators with each maybe 0.5% stake, their relative stakes on chain A and chain B might be even less than the actual block reward or transaction fees they would get from creating a new block. So that incentivizes them to create multiple blocks across all these different parts of the fork. Like the same attack on a proof of work model would look something like this. So if you had a certain fixed amount of computational power, the only way you can mine on both chains is if you split up your computational power, which means your expected value of rewards still remains the same. But that's not the case in the chain-based proof of stake model. So how do we prevent that? Well, there are a couple of solutions. The first is called simultaneous slasher. The idea here is at every proof of stake round, you pick randomly 64 validators who gain this privilege called signing privileges. And these validators are chosen 2,000 blocks in advance. Now the maximum blockchain or the longest blockchain is chosen based on the weight of the signatures on each of the forks. So if fork A has more signatures, then fork A becomes the longest and most accepted blockchain. Now if the malicious actor tries to sign on 2 simultaneous forks, then a future honest validator could basically call him out on it and include a proof of double signing in his future block. This basically slashes all the rewards of the malicious validator, and the honest one gets 1/3 of the rewards in return for being a good actor. The drawback of this, of course, is that it requires all the validators to be online all the time. Because if you were chosen to be a signer 2,000 blocks ago and you want to exercise that right now, you need to always be online to know if it's your turn or not. Another issue is that because you're informing these validators that they're going to be signers so ahead of time, you just need to hope that they don't collude together. So maybe if all 64 of the signers decide we're going to sign on 2 chains and fork the blockchain, there's nothing you can do about it in future. So here's an example of how the simultaneous slasher works, the expected value of a validator to mine on just chain A is 0.9, and the expected value of mining on just chain B is 0.1. But the expected value of simultaneously creating a block on both chain A and chain B costs the validator -4 ether or -4 token. So it's kind of like a way to disincentivize from simultaneous signing. You have a more improved version of the simultaneous slasher, which is basically slash the validator who signs on the wrong chain, not necessarily just simultaneously signs. So this closely mirrors proof of work in the sense that if you have a miner who mined on the wrong chain, not only does he not get the block rewards or transaction fees, he's also actually losing some money because he's paying electricity to mine on the wrong chain. And in a sense, he's getting penalized for doing that. This forces validators to be more alert and mine on only the right blockchain. And of course, the example here is if you mine on only chain A, which is the right chain, your expected reward is 0.9. But if you mine on chain B or create a block on chain B, you should be losing 4.4 stake tokens. Versus if you vote on both, you're still losing tokens, but you're just losing 4 tokens. Questions about this? Yeah. Well, you know which is right based on like maybe which one has the longest or more signatures. Do you remember how we're weighing?
My understanding is in proof of work, everybody's like mining different blocks.
Yeah.
And then whoever's first wins.
Yeah.
So how is this different then? Because if everybody's mining on different blocks.
So you have one validator at a given point of time. It's not like you're racing anymore, but that validator is kind of incentivized to mine on the chain which has the maximum weight in terms of signatures and not like create his block on the one with less signatures, because if he does that, he's going to get slashed.
Right, but we're talking about the 64 people
Yeah.
that have signature weight.
Yeah.
They all have to, they're the ones that lose stake if they
No, they're not. Okay, so the 64 people, oh yeah, actually, yeah. No, they're the ones who lose their security deposit if they sign on the wrong block.
So then how do they know which one to vote on?
I mean, they can look at the blockchain and see which of these forks has the most signatures, and that's the one they should ideally be signing on.
So another question that
Yeah.
kind of incorporates like a bird's eye view.
Yeah.
It seems to me like proof of stake, it's inevitable that the rich will get richer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it seems to me that a 51% attack is not guaranteed or inevitable. It's just, it may happen.
Yeah.
It's bad.
Yeah.
But proof of stake is inevitable. Like, it will happen. So why would I do something that will guarantee be bad over something that may be bad?
The thing is, with proof of stake, even though you might have a chance of a 51% attack, you're assuming that no one's going to do it, because if they do it, it's like burning their own stake tokens. Because with, like I talked about.
I'm not saying that. I understand.
Oh, okay.
51% attack is gone.
Yeah.
in Proof of stake. But my concern now is the rich getting richer.
Oh, rich getting richer. Well,
That's like a big negative to me.
yeah, and like there haven't really been implementations which talk about how to solve that, but some of the implementations that exist are like from way back in 2012, and they are just shitty. That's just the way it is. So yeah, if you have a solution to that, you can propose one. Yeah.
Kind of weigh up which one's better.
Yeah. Yeah, that is definitely a huge problem with proof of stake. Yeah. Okay. So, an even better solution is the BFT based proof of stake solution. If you recall, BFT is where you propose a block and not create one. In this, because you kind of reach agreement at the block level and you don't really wait till later, no kind of forking exists. So this basically means that since you're done agreeing at that level, you're never going to have to go back or slash funds or any of that. And if someone acts in a malicious manner, you can still figure that out later and slash their funds. Yeah.
Who's determining who's malicious?
The idea here is that all the validators in the network have to be alert and constantly on the lookout. So we'll talk about it more in like censorship attacks or something, where if you notice that a certain validator is never including transactions that maybe have Lightning Network turned on, right? Then you suspect them. Then you can like talk about it to everyone else and then say maybe they're being malicious. Yeah, good question. Okay, so let's now talk about what an equivalent to the 51% attack in Bitcoin would be, or what it would look like in proof of stake. So the most benign kind of attack is an attack on finality. So finality basically means if Gloria created this block and she added it to the blockchain, you don't want it to be unfinalized. Like, you want the blockchain to be immutable. If someone's trying to change the history of the blockchain, that is an attack on finality. The defense against this is basically, okay, someone's already forked the blockchain, the damage is done, but the community needs to now communicate amongst themselves, could be over social media, Slack, Reddit, however, and decide on which chain they're going to accept. If the community is too large, they can just rely on market prices of both these chains, and the one with the higher price will eventually be accepted as the main proof of stake chain. A more dangerous form of 51% attack is if any single validator or malicious actor has more than 34% of voting power, they can ensure that the blockchain never reaches consensus. So what that means is the blockchain never converges. The defense against this is you could, at a protocol level, say, okay, if after a day no new blocks are created, then we will switch up the validator set. What it means for the blockchain to not reach consensus is that if you recall back to the BFT system, if you have 33% of voting power, you could always vote no on all the blocks that come up, which means no new transactions can be made in the network, which means no new blocks are ever being created. So no one's transactions are being validated. That is basically what liveness denial means. Another defense against this kind of attack is the community can just decide to hard fork and kick off the dishonest people who are always voting no. But the most dangerous kind of attack is a censorship attack, where this group of malicious actors with more than 34% of voting power always rejects certain kind of transactions. It could be like, maybe someone who has SegWit turned on, we're always going to reject them. Or maybe someone who has zero knowledge proofs in their transactions, I don't want that, I'm always going to vote no. This is still not as dangerous if the attacker has less than 67% mining power, because now the honest nodes can kind of start paying attention and realize, oh, these certain application-related transactions are not going through, so this validator is being malicious. We refuse to create any new blocks on top of his block, or we'll always vote no on his blocks. And this then transforms into a liveness denial attack, which we just saw how to solve. If the malicious adversary now has more than 67% voting power, you need a completely different strategy. Because now, even your honest majority cannot vote no on any block that you're proposing, if you remember in the BFT proof of stake case. So this leads us into transaction censorship attacks. The problem here is you cannot differentiate between each of these three situations. So you cannot tell apart if Gloria tried to send a transaction of 5 Bitcoin and got unfairly censored. Or Gloria tried to send a transaction of 5 Bitcoin, but the transaction fees was so low that it never got included. Or Gloria never even sent this transaction of 5 Bitcoin and she's just falsely claiming that it got censored. So there are a couple of defenses to transaction censorship. The first is make censorship costly for everyone. So if 100 validators sign on a block, then everyone gets the complete rewards. But if some validators don't sign on a block, then the rewards of the network from that point on becomes less than the complete value. The idea here is that you're going to have altruistic validators who are always looking out for the best of the network and are okay getting penalized. And if they see any censorship happening, they won't sign the block, which means they'll still get penalized, but they're okay with that. The drawbacks of making censorship costly is it's a gradual increase in cost, which means censorship to some degree can still exist. Also, you could have this issue of malicious validators who just refuse to sign a block and like penalize the rest of the network just for fun. This also makes a huge assumption that you have people who are altruists. If everyone was only economically rational, then no one would ever call out someone else trying to censor a block. And all these economically rational people would avoid including transactions that could ever be censored. So this is where we talk about time lock cryptography. Okay. The idea here is the sender basically creates a transaction and encrypts his transaction using 2 large prime numbers, P and Q, and sends this encryption over to the validator. Now the validator doesn't know what was in the transaction, and it's going to take him log n time if he has to unencrypt or decrypt every single transaction that he has. That means he might just get a timeout by the time he proposes a block. So the idea here is the validator just puts all these transactions that are encrypted into a block and then proposes that, and then 24 hours later he can do all this computation and reveal what the actual transactions were. Honest validators would be okay and open to using the scheme because they're not trying to censor any kind of users or any kind of applications. And the idea here is doing this decryption is maybe 1 hour of work. So if you gave a validator 24 hours after proposing the block, he can still get his rewards as long as he does that 1 hour of work later. The interesting part about this scheme is it either guarantees complete censorship or no censorship at all. So what that means is unless all the validators come together and collude and agree that they're not going to include any transactions that are encrypted, you will always have this censorship resistance characteristic. Questions about that? Okay. So this brings us to another attack called stake grinding. The problem here is, if you recall, in proof of stake, you want to have this randomness property which helps you pick the next validator. And not just the next validator, but the next sequence of validators. That's because if your next validator happens to be offline, you want to pick a sequence of people who can step in for him. The problem here is that the next chosen validator depends on the previous block's signature. So the current validator can basically just brute force all kinds of signatures and find one that improves his chance of becoming the validator again. In NXT's implementation, if you pass up on the opportunity of being a validator right now, you control this. You have a way to manipulate the randomness for all future rounds. So that means you say no now, but you get 12 chances of being a validator after this, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of randomness. The defense against this is remove any mutable parameters in the block that are used to generate this randomness. So if you remove whatever the validator is trying to brute force and just not have that contribute to randomness, there's nothing he can do. Another idea is have all the validators deposit their stake well in advance. So what that means is if only the current round determined the future validator set or the future validator, if I was malicious, I could just invest, say, $50,000 right now, if that improves my chance of being a validator for the next round, and then pull out all my investment after that. But if you have all the validators staked in way ahead of time, and you say determine the next validator like 2,000 blocks ahead, they're always forced to be staked in till they become the validator. Another idea is you could have this sort of threshold signatures sharing scheme where all the validators together determine the randomness for the network. And unless, of course, the majority of them collude, this scheme is pretty safe. Okay, questions on that? Yeah.
You're giving the power to the validators to generate random values, or essentially they can make themselves.
Yeah, that is the problem. But that's why if you have them collaborate, you're assuming that they cannot give the power to themselves. Like they would have to decide who they're giving the power to. And assuming that they're not going to collude is okay. Yeah. Okay, so this brings us to our last attack, which is called data unavailability. So the premise here is you have an attacker who creates a block with some transactions, but maybe one of the transactions is invalid, or maybe it's just malformed. The idea here is anyone on the whole Bitcoin or blockchain network should be able to look at the block and download all the transactions and say if the Merkle root is valid or not. And if these transactions are invalid, they should be able to call out this malicious attacker on his block. So to call out someone, you would generate what's called a fraud proof. So you would basically just submit all these blue hashes, and if they hash to the same value as the Merkle root, it means your proof is valid. If not, it's invalid. So if you're just being someone who wants to call out people randomly, you're going to have to put in a security deposit and have that slashed if you're just calling out people wrongly. But if your fraud proof is valid, then the malicious actor's reward gets slashed and you get some of that reward in return. The problem here is, what if the attacker just chooses to hide some of the ill-formed data? Now you don't know if it's ill-formed data or if it's valid data, so you cannot construct any kind of fraud proof. So you basically cannot distinguish between either of these cases. Case one is you have an attacker who publishes a block with some amount of missing data. An honest node raises an alarm, but before the rest of the network can act, the attacker publishes the remaining data. In situation two, you have an honest node who publishes all the data, but then you have a malicious attacker who just raises a false alarm for fun. And both these cases look the same to an outside third party. So let's talk about how we can defend against this. Here you basically require blocks to use erasure codes, which we talked about earlier in the cryptography section. So erasure codes is basically this idea that, okay, I think my attacker is going to hide some information, so I'm going to try and get him to extend all the data he's using, so that even if he hides some information, I can get back the original amount of information that I needed. And now, anytime someone creates a block, you probabilistically check all these values of the erasure code that they sent and see enough data is available. From this simple check, you know one of the following three things are true. Either the complete erasure code data is available and the data can be constructed correctly, which means the block might also be valid, in which case no one needs to submit a fraud proof, everything's good. The second case, you have some of the data available, but the erasure code is completely available, which means I can reconstruct the original data that I need, but the block is invalid. In such a case, I can create a fraud proof and call out the attacker for just putting in wrong transactions. And the final case is the entire data is unavailable and the erasure code is constructed badly. So that means I can't recover all the data that I need. In that case, I can construct a third kind of fraud proof, which basically calls out the attacker for not turning in all the data that he should have. And that is basically the defense against the data unavailability problem. So that's pretty much the end of today's lecture. Next week, we're going to talk about alternative consensus. Share your readings. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Yeah? Okay.